It's always that noise as we start. Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait for everyone to filter in, and then we'll get going. Right. Still a few more filtering in over the next few minutes, but good morning, everyone, and welcome to this waterfront webinar on reducing emissions in ports. We're going to be discussing the current initiatives and next steps of ports on their journeys to net zero. My name is Mark Simmons. I'm the Director of Policy at the British Ports Association. I'm going to be moderating today's session with the Trade Association for ports all around the UK, and this is, of course, a very topical discussion, likely to be topical for the next 30 years, I think. But it's an ever-increasing part of our workload in our discussions with government, with governments all across the UK and internationally. I'm delighted to be joined by Vicky Beattie from the Port of Dover and Colin McNaught from Ricardo. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I would encourage everyone as we're getting these presentations to ask questions in the chat and think about any questions you might want to ask in person, and we'll take those in the usual way after both speakers have spoken. So with that, we'll get started. I think we've still got a few more people trickling in as always, but we've only got an hour today. So our first speaker will be Colin McNaught. Is the Director of Strategic Growth and Development at Ricardo. Many of you will be familiar with Ricardo, a global consultancy and engineering firm, engineering and environmental consultancy rather. Colin has a wealth of experience, 30 years in providing advice on energy issues for policymakers and investors. His work was initially in energy efficiency and industrial processes for CHP, followed by opportunities to deploy renewable energy systems in the UK, Europe and beyond, although his more recent work has focused on decarbonisation options for transport, and particularly the production and use of green fuels for road, rail and marine use. Colin, you've got 10 minutes to say your stuff, and then we'll go over to Vicky, who I'll introduce afterwards, and then I look forward to questions and discussion after that. So Colin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to Waterfront for organising this. Our kind of interest and role within ports and shipping is, I guess, on two fronts: one, policy, and the second, practical. So we do quite a bit of work, particularly within our energy environment team, on policy studies for the European Commission, so on the emissions trading proposals and the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive. We're working for the IMO at the moment on some well-to-wake life cycle assessment of fuels and propulsion systems. And we're also doing practical work, particularly from our Shoreham site, where our engineering teams are, for example, working on a hydrogen ferry, both main propulsion and auxiliary power for a ferry in the Orkney Islands. So I was going to kind of make kind of four overarching kind of points, one of which is that from where I sit outside the industry, but hoping to support the industry, it seems to be a huge time of disruption. You've had Brexit and COVID concurrently, and obviously that's had a huge practical impact on ports in terms of workforce, in terms of HGV drivers, in terms of containers. And while that's obviously been probably some of the most challenging times, I imagine, for many of you in your working careers, it also has the possible silver lining that ports are now recognised both in the public and the minds of policymakers as being part of the UK's critical infrastructure, and therefore worthy of investment, attention and care to make sure that the roles that you play within our economy, not just your own activities, but the wider economy, are actually protected and nurtured and grown for the future. The second overarching theme I wanted to pick up on was the climate change one. Not surprising given the recent conclusion of COP26. I'm based in Glasgow and had a small involvement in that. I attended the International Chamber of Shipping side event, and I wasn't at the previous one in Madrid 2 years ago, but those that were at both commented to me that last time the debate was whether they needed to decarbonize, whereas this time it was all about how and which fuels and how quickly. Still quite a lot of diverse opinion on the answers to some of those questions, but that's to a degree the nature of the industry being very diverse in itself. And there's a big difference between the larger shipping lines and the smaller ones. There's a very big difference between the liner routes and the spot cargo routes in terms of what they can do and how they interact with you in the port sector to provide those zero carbon fuels for the future. I think even though the climate change declaration is only 8 pages, it may surprise you to know that after 2 weeks and about 30,000 delegates, it's only an 8-page document. And most of the commitments, the verbs they use are quite soft. I think that we are starting to see more action from the private sector, running in some degrees in advance of the climate change declaration, because they're in the public eye, because their supply chain is demanding it of them. And therefore, you're seeing the leaders start to move with early demonstrations, early commitments on climate change issues. So although the words in the document might be quite vague and a bit warm, we are starting to see actual change. Third point is around the position of ports. We work in the road sector, the rail sector, and the aviation sector, as well as in ports and shipping. And unfortunately, you have some of the most complex challenges. Most of the other sectors, the fuel choices are relatively narrow. The variety of ownership, scales, etc., are relatively similar. But in ports, the number of fuels that could be used by ships, the number of onshore power options, the type of cargoes and passenger vessels you serve, the sizes of the vessels, the ownership arrangements are much more complex than any of the other sectors we work in. So, as the Chinese say, you live in interesting times in the port sector, having to deal with, I think, the same challenges as other transport modes, but with a much more complex starting position, and therefore a very different change, I think, and probably a different relationship between yourselves and the shipping customers that you serve, because previously you would have been relatively disconnected from their fuel use and fuel provision. In the future, that's going to be different. And I think the relationships you have in the future might be very different and more cooperative, hopefully, to be able to achieve the kind of changes that are envisaged. The final point I was going to make very briefly was around hubs. As you will already be aware, ports are naturally hubs between the seagoing transport and land-based. But I think low carbon solutions bring that close together, because you have the heavy duty trucks, you have the rail links in many ports, and therefore you're naturally connected to other transport modes which are on the same decarbonisation journey. And I think we can also see a trend for ports to be more involved in the wider decarbonisation and circular economy initiatives of the future. I'm based in Glasgow, so a couple of ones that are very visible to me are the announcement earlier this week about Port of Nig hosting a new offshore wind tower facility, which follows on from the Humber and the Tees announcements about wind turbine blades. There's a dry dock in Greenock that has been unused for decades, that's planned to be recommissioned as a ship dismantling facility rather than taking ships to India or Bangladesh. So there are new economic opportunities in these sectors, as well as the challenges that you and your shipping customers face in decarbonisation. So my concluding point was that perhaps you are living in the most challenging times for your sector, but I think there are reasons to view that as being offering opportunities and exciting times for careers of those in the sector. So thank you for the invitation today, and hopefully that's a useful set of background points.
Brilliant. Thank you, Colin. Just a quick reminder, please ask any questions via the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat. and get those in whenever they come to you. And we'll pick those up after Vicky has spoken. And so which brings me to our next speaker, Vicky Beattie, Head of Safety, Quality and Environment at the Port of Dover. Vicky has 25 years experience in the relevant fields of environment and safety management across a wide range of industries, including maritime, transport, waste, quarrying, construction and waste to energy. So a lot of sectors, Vicky. And Vicky has led the development, implementation, management and integration of ISO compliant management systems in a variety of complex operational environments with numerous stakeholders, and has extensive experience working in permitted and regulated activities, ensuring operational compliance and the development of robust policy and procedure to deliver compliance and improvement. She has recently led the Dover Harbour Board team to collaborate with the Universities of Kent and Warwick, P&O Ferries and Schneider Electric on a successful clean maritime demonstration competition funding bid, which I'm, if Vicky doesn't pick that up, I will be asking about it. Having been awarded the funding, they're now working hard to deliver the feasibility study and formulating plans for the next stage of the project. So Vicky, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and morning all. Yes, thanks for that introduction. So yes, I'm from the Port of Dover, so here to give a port's perspective, and I'm sure some of the perspectives we have will certainly be reflected in other ports. And I would welcome, the opportunity to share views and get that confirmation or challenges from other ports. So a little bit about Dover. Many of you are aware of Dover as a ferry port, and indeed we are pretty strategic for not just the southeast of England, but the UK itself, with around £144 billion worth of freight in value passing through Dover, which is about 33% of all UK trade with the EU. And so, we do carry an awful lot of freight, and many people will picture the White Cliffs and the ferries transiting the channel, but we do a little more than that as well. And as much as ferry is a challenge, some may not be aware that we also have a cruise terminal, and it's the second busiest cruise terminal in the UK. Next year we have quite a number of visits of a variety of cruise vessels coming into the port. We also handle cargo, well, admittedly on a smaller scale than many, but we do handle quite a lot of sort of loose bulk cargo as well as containers, and we have a new refrigerated cargo terminal to handle particularly soft fruits. Bananas has been our speciality in the past. We also have a marina, and so we need to meet the leisure market. And as many ports have, we have a large sort of buildings portfolio. So we have a lot of infrastructure to maintain, much of it historic infrastructure, and so needs careful looking after, and a number of properties, so a large property portfolio that we need to maintain, and obviously have a number of tenants. So yeah, we're seen as ferry, but we have an awful lot more within our whole portfolio that we need to sort of manage to help us meet our sustainability agenda. And to be honest, we're starting out on our main part of our sustainability agenda just now. We have managed since 2007 to reduce our carbon footprint by 60%. And we have done that very much by concentrating on our direct impacts, which many of you will also have done the same. So some fairly basic but important and effective projects that we have done during that time. LED replacement, so our large high masts across the port now are all LED, which has a great energy efficiency there. We have 2 PV arrays that now supply power to the 2 buildings, the new refrigerated cargo terminal I mentioned, and our passenger handling building. We are one of the ports that submitted an air quality strategy as required by the legislation. What that helped us to understand, and hopefully to communicate to what the wider audience, is that actually our impact in terms of emissions is very small. It's less than 10% of the overall emissions of the wider port ecosystem, if you like, when you take into into context all of the vessels that enter and exit the port, all of the traffic that flows through the port, our actual impact directly is only 10% of that. And that creates us that big complex problem that Colin was mentioning earlier. And that's certainly a challenge going forward to try and make sure that we can influence the greening of the whole port infrastructure. Obviously, we can help to green our own direct impacts. What are we doing? Well, we're looking into transitioning from white diesel to HVO. We're looking to do that for all of our plant vehicles. You mentioned the shore power initiative, the funding bid that we were successful in gaining. That's taking up a lot of time at the moment, so we can better understand what the needs will be of us as a port going forward in order to supply appropriate energy to the ferries of the future that are due to be coming. The first two of those are coming over the next 2 to 3 years. We're also looking into EV charging, mainly because many of our Ministry of Justice related port partners working on our port have deadlines for moving to electric vehicles, or certainly greening their fleets ahead of the government targets. So 2027, many of our MOJ partners have to meet those. So we need to react and provide facilities to enable those partners to help them meet their objectives. Embodied carbon is something that we are looking. We do a lot of construction. We have a large development project recently finished to produce the terminal, the refrigerated cargo terminal. So we'll be looking to see how we can start to measure and control perhaps the amount of embodied carbon we're using. We've got to push it down the supply chain and make much more out of things like ESOS that we're already required to produce ESOS reports. So what are we actually doing about it? How are we using those? If we look at next steps, which was the other questions sort of posed by the title of the meeting, the next steps are those challenges around the complexity and the fact that most of the people working on our port and not us are the contributors to emissions. So we need to work with the port community. Electricity is certainly part of, electrical power is certainly part of the future demands to meet the greening of the port as a whole. And we have grid restrictions here, and I'm sure many other ports have the same. And so we're going to need some help, financial, but other help in order to help us be able to supply the appropriate amount of energy to the various vessels across our port. Battery storage, we think, will play a large part in that, but we do have, particularly at the Port of Dover, we do have quite a space restriction. So things like PV arrays and large battery storage areas, we just don't have the space for. So we've got to be innovative in our approaches going forward. The other challenge, again, as Colin muted, there are many potential solutions to particularly the vessel fuel question, and there are still a number of things in the mix, and as yet most of those various different maritime vessels, maritime industries within themselves haven't quite plumped yet for the type of fuel that they are going to use in the longer term. And it would really help us if we could begin to see what they're looking at. So green corridors was also mentioned. The Clydebank Declaration, hugely interesting to us. As I mentioned, you know, we're pretty important to UK trade, particularly at Dover, and you know, closest corridor to the EU. You know, we're very interested in making sure, seeing how we can use that to green ourselves, our port ecosystem, and create a green corridor between us and the EU. And they were the sort of key points, really, just purely from a Port of Dover point of view, hoping that it will prompt lots of questions and conversation from here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. That's really interesting. I've got lots of questions. There's also some in the chat, quite a few in the chat, actually. So we'll start in the order that they've come in. And the first one from Sean Benstead, from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. I think actually the hardest question in the chat is the first one. what work of ports and I'm on the hook here for the Ports Association engaged in around community wealth building. So Sean says that ports have a large amount of economic influence to operate as an anchor through mobilizing procurement spending, employment practice and land use to benefit their surrounding communities in their transition to net zero. Vicky, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is there anything anything going on in the wider community with Dover? And I know you're a trust port, so you've got community representatives on your board. Is there anything anything there you'd like to pick up before I come to Colin and then answer it myself?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Well, obviously I can only speak from our point of view, and we certainly have a community engagement program and community funding and charities that we give to each year. We have an awarding body that we can give to charities. This is certainly something we're beginning to embed the whole sustainable development and the 17 sustainable development goals. And obviously there's a number of things in there that hit on exactly this point. So starting from within, and many organizations will be doing this, hitting everything from looking at actually gender pay gaps, looking at making sure that we pay fairly within the organization and relative to the surrounding area. But probably more exciting than that is we certainly recognize that there will be, with all of these new technologies coming in, there's going to be skills gaps. And we will begin to be talking to particularly the local universities and other education establishments to help bring along that talent, bring along and encourage that gap to close so that we can have the knowledge base, particularly around STEM, into the future. So very early doors on that sort of thing at the moment for us, but it's certainly something that we are aware of, and making sure that if we can try and recruit the right people and from more of the local area, then obviously that's going to hopefully be helping raise the whole local community and address these sorts of issues. I mentioned that we want to look down the supply chain, and yeah, again, very early doors for us. But this year, one of our challenges is to create a sustainable sort of purchasing policy, for want of a better term. Yeah, early doors, but absolutely, we push it down the supply chain. Do we look at where we source from, how far, distance, the carbon miles, etc., of all of our items? Yeah. Difficult to know exactly how far we'll go on that just yet, but absolutely on the agenda. So nothing definitive, but you're right. It's important that we recognise that as ports, our community is important to us. So yeah, early doors for us as Port of Dover.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll come back to Sean's come back on that. And Colin, do you have anything?
Yeah, sure. A couple of points. Working with Shore and Port, because it's the closest port to one of our big sites, our Shore and Technical Centre in Sussex. And in my discussions with them, I've always been impressed about how their trust port status, like Vicky and Dover, inform their thinking and their decision making. Specific kind of example of the kind of local economic opportunities. They are planning with a company called H2 Green to develop a hydrogen production facility. With any type of hydrogen, it's important to secure the customers to actually have the initial income to justify the investment. Hydrogen's pretty expensive to transport by road, and therefore it has to be local customers. And therefore, although the hydrogen system has been developed by a third party and the port doesn't own that, it's part of discussions with the local potential users, of which Ricardo happens to be one, because our test centre is converting some of our diesel engine test beds to run hydrogen engines and hydrogen fuel cells, partly for shipping use. So that's an example of something related to climate change. The initial hydrogen use is not in the ships, but it will create a low carbon fuel in a port, which will have both external and internal use. And I've seen kind of, I guess, a second theme. There are quite a lot of ports which are associated with our former heavy industries, which have in many cases now gone, and there's quite a lot of brownfield land around ports. So in a wider kind of local economic strategy, and kind of linking perhaps to levelling up agendas as well. I think there are a lot of ports which have land, which could be used for new green industries, and we touched a little bit about wind turbines and circular economy ideas a moment ago in the introduction. So I think there's more potential for that as well.
Thanks, Colin. And I'm not a panelist as such, but I will say, Sean, if you look on our website, you'll find a community report that touches on some. It's a couple of years old now, I think, but it touches on some of the things that different ports around the country are doing in their community. But obviously, yeah, I completely agree with everything Colin and Vicky said, and that you've said, that ports are obviously rooted in their communities, and we're very proud of that, and make a lot of that to government. But do have a look at that report on our website. I've got loads of questions coming in. I'm going to take them in the order they've come in, but one person at a time, if that makes sense. So Phil, I'll come back to some of your questions, which some of which I was going to ask as well. So the next one is from Phil Buckley. How do we manage the gap between shipping and ports? So shipping is international and commercial, whereas ports tend to be national or regional in some cases. I would say also in this country, at least, ports are definitely commercial entities as well. But it's an interesting question for both of you. I'll start with Colin this time. We'll reverse it. How do you bridge that gap between an industry, shipping, that's regulated internationally, and ports which are regulated by national governments?
Sure. At the ICS conference in Glasgow, that was quite a big topic. It was Chatham House rules, so I can't quote who said things, but there was one observation that the IMO are the international regulatory body, but yet the European Commission has set carbon trading rules that include half the distance travelled or half the fuel used in international waters. And I thought actually one of the biggest challenges for the sector is governance. If you take like an environment, social governance kind of acronym, I thought governance seemed to be the one issue that there was less progress on. And I guess that's partly because governing bodies tend to protect, if that's the right phrase, their role, because it's their raison d'etre and what they do. And I think that also extends into the commercial relationships, as Phil's question. I think the solutions here are probably less visible, partly because they're commercial and therefore may not be public domain. I think secondly, that when a shipping operator, and it will probably be the larger companies who are earlier in this and who want to be leaders, will want to have a certain fuel available at certain ports and enter into one-to-one discussions with their key partners in the port sector about those vessels and those routes. So I think that will take a while to spread out from those kind of leaders, early adopters, into the wider sector. But I suspect that might be the way in which this opens up.
Thanks, Colin. Vicky, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, to take the second point, are IMO and regional national bodies truly aligned? Well, I think again, it's early doors, isn't it? Really, I think if you think about what was spoken about at the BPA conference, it's the first time I've really heard the whole sustainability agenda being talked about in a forum like that, and really being put in front of all of the CEOs of various port authorities, various ports within the UK. So they've got to be, surely, absolutely. But yeah, to be honest, Mark, I think that's where organisations like yourselves come in to help bridge that gap and to bring those organisations and get them aligned, because there is no one individual organisation that will solve this. It has to be a collaboration, but then that's where difficulties arise.
Can I be provocative for the sake of this entertainment in this webinar? But does it matter what the IMO does to you, Vicky, at the Port of Dover, if or other ports that you work with, Colin? If the EU and the UK is sort of doing similar things, let's assume, and going way beyond sort of what the IMO is prepared to do, at least for the time being, does it really matter what's going on at the IMO?
Well, I think for us, we still have to keep very closely aligned with much of the EU legislation, not to necessarily comply with it, but because the other side of the water for us, the ports in France will need to comply with those things. Then any challenges they're meeting, our ferry operators in particular will need to then align themselves to that. They're then going to want that same those same things back in our port. So the expectation of what we provide will be the same. So we do need to align ourselves certainly with EU. In terms of the IMO, well, I mean, at the end of the day, we've got to try and keep everyone happy, and there are many hats. But for us, we still have to stay very aligned and aware of movements in the EU. They're likely to come into UK legislation anyway, aren't they? Many things do, even though we're not part of the EU anymore. Over to Colin.
Thanks. Yeah, Colin.
I think I'd go back to that point I made at the outset about the huge diversity in ports, their size, their trade. Clearly, some ports, Southampton, Felixstowe, Port London, etc., have a huge amount of international traffic, which does come under IMO. But there are lots of ports which are UK only. Even the EU legislation, the emissions trading is 5,000 gross tons and up. So there'll be some ports whose trade doesn't get touched by that. So I think there will be very diverse impacts. So the governance issues will hit the big guys with the IMO traffic, and less as you go down the kind of scale and international dimension of each port.
Thanks both. I'd love to continue talking about this bit, but we've got loads of questions to get through, so we'll leave that one there. The next question is from Jeremy Littlejohn. Are UK ports expecting to start requiring contracted vessels, so pilot vessels, dredgers, tugs, and so on, to use low emission fuels? So I'd be interested in any views there from you both on the vessels owned by the port and those that are used by other commercial services. Sorry, the lights keep coming on and off.
No problem.
We'll take Jeremy's second question at the same time. Do UK ports have the authority to ban or impose additional costs on port users not taking emission reduction measures? So what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of putting any imposition on any of your port users, both on the water side and the sort of terrestrial side? Vicky, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, yeah. So certainly those under our control, we will be looking with future investment in new vessels. We'll certainly be looking to green them one way or t'other. Exactly what that looks like will depend how the technologies are moving. But in terms of contracted, we don't have those. But should we have them, this is about the supply chain. And I think we do need to begin to move towards pushing the requirements, because it begins then to work with the whole port ecosystem and not just looking at your own direct impacts, but those that are a bit more indirect, and then eventually those you can influence. So I think it's coming, but obviously there has to be, we all need to function in an economically sustainable way. And so there will need to be, huge consideration on the commercial impact of enforcing anything like that on contracted vessels. But I do think it needs to move in that direction, certainly, because we are a whole port ecosystem, and some ports, that contribution from those port vessels, is certainly worthy of acting on in order to hit that overall port ecosystem impact, if you like. In terms of banning or imposing additional costs, I believe one port has introduced a sort of green tariff. Certainly, we're looking at all options at the Port of Dover, and the way we'd like to move is a bit like the was it the ETI that came in or is sort of out there, but basically more, rather than penalising, actually sort of rewarding those with a good environmental credentials. So we're looking at all options. It's very early stages at the moment, but just how feasible is that to be able to reward the cleaner vessels and that sort of thing? So certainly I think a lot of ports will be looking into this sort of thing.
Thanks, Vicky. Colin, just going on from what Vicky said there, do you think these schemes where vessels are rewarded for good green behaviour, have you seen any are you aware of any of those, or have you had much to do with them? Have they had much impact?
So there is a little bit of that thinking within the EU marine fuel proposals. I think they looked at 3 kind of policy options, and the one that they preferred was one which would over reward organizations, operators that went beyond what was required by legislation, though yet obviously the detail of how that reward might be applied, and of course wouldn't actually apply to a UK port directly. So you can see it's interesting that that thinking, that principle is in European Commission kind of documentation, at least the draft. I think the other thing I was going to briefly mention was to kind of build on Vicky's reply. Yeah, we've talked to multiple ports about these 3 types of vessel because they're very much in the ports in mind. Like Dover, quite a few ports own these vessels. And a particular project I'd like to just flag is we've also got a couple of Clean Maritime Demonstration Fund projects, one of which is in Shetland, where we're looking at 6 classes of vessel and the appropriate zero carbon propulsion. And we'll be working with Shetland Islands Council, Strathclyde University, Babcock, to look at those. Tugs and pilot boats are part of that, because in Shetland Island Council owns 3 of the main ports, and the tugs and pilot boats and actually inter-island ferries. So around about March time, hopefully we'll be publishing, and then having some events that cover what solutions look to be most appropriate for those vessels. And the reason I mention that is partly because it will probably be interesting to some of the attendees to see the results, but secondly, to whether you're going to require or encourage or reward a green solution, you have to have a practical green solution available, and therefore foresight on what those might be, what the cost would be, can you fit it on the vessel, etc. So hopefully that study would provide some information to provide that kind of platform of data and insight.
Do you think people should be rewarded for good green behaviour, vessel owners, or is just from a fundamental point of principle, or are we in such a situation now that it's just whatever it takes to get where we need to go?
I think if I can reflect on completely different sectors, they've almost always had some kind of encouragement as well as penalty. The forms of those can be very different, whether the penalty is an outright ban, and therefore it's not the case of paying a carbon tax or some other pollution tax. The form of which those take can be very different. It should be appropriate to the sector, and also the practicalities of enforcing things. Shipping is, by definition, more mobile, difficult to monitor, difficult to measure, and therefore the practical elements of any regulation have to be taken into account, not just the principles. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, just from a practical point, Jeremy, as well, I don't think ports can penalise ships for doing. I think there's this open port duty we have in the UK means you have to. I don't think it's possible, but I think a bigger restraint is the commercial consideration. So it's not so much whether ports can, it's whether ports would penalise their customers essentially for doing something that isn't against the rules. But it's an interesting question. Well, we've got another. So Phil, we'll come back to your next question as I want to take one from Morris, who we cover the people who haven't asked their questions yet. Morris Kerr, does the Port of Dover propose any specific systems or approaches to tackle embodied carbon associated with developments within the port? So, for example, considering, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. Sequel. Yes. Well, yes. Considering that assessment through the design and construction stage.
Yeah, well, I can, yes, we have used exactly that sequel for our development of the Western Docks, the most recent developments, actually achieving outstanding during that. So it is a good model. There are a number of models, and you don't have to use a model such as that, but it is a very good one that helps you to look at the whole environmental impact all the way through from design to delivery, particularly of larger scale projects. So yeah, we've certainly used that ourselves, and we would be looking to use similar or perhaps even just our own measures. There are various models out there the way you can input your various materials, and using various, multipliers, coefficients, etc. You can calculate those. So yeah, absolutely with USQL. No reason not to use it going forward. But yeah, we will use something similar.
Brilliant, thank you. And Colin, are you familiar? Is that common practice? Are you aware of that sort of thing happening in other developments?
That's certainly been an issue that's been people in the carbon and the energy environment sector have been very aware of embodied emissions for a long time, but it's becoming much more prominent as people look at their entire carbon footprint, and back to Vicky's point about scope 3 emissions. And I think we've helped companies do life cycle assessments that have shown that their products are actually using maybe recycled materials and therefore have advantages. And we can see that happening through, I'm going to take a completely different sector for a moment, sorry. Ricardo's heritage originally in automotive, therefore we do a lot of work for the automotive OEM. So you can see, for example, Volvo have a very strict policy of procurement, passing down requirements to their tier 1 suppliers who provide major components to have low embodied carbon targets within what they do, and then they pass that down to their suppliers. So you might be, say, somebody who's doing a casting, they pass it down to their steel manufacturer, and so on and so on. So while I'm not sure this has maybe hit the shipping sector quite so much as early, in other sectors we can see that happening. Historically, we never ever did any work for tier 1 automotive component suppliers that provide kind of body parts, but we're now doing a lot more work for them on these environmental issues because their tier 1, their OEM customers are requiring them to do so. And embodied carbon has the same element as Dover have done and others have done. They find that actually their own scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are relatively modest. 80–90% of almost all the companies we've done net zero plans for, it ends up in scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. And that, I think, and I'm going to come back to shipping here for a moment, you'll be glad to know, that also means that the companies whose products are transported by ship are also going to be more conscious of the contribution of shipping emissions to their scope 3 emissions. So that's getting a huge amount of momentum. And I don't think it's going to stop, because once you realize that the pain you get as a company is only for 10% of the total carbon emissions and the rest of it's in your supply chain, you are going to want to transfer that pain to your supply chain.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat and then go back to the ones in the Q&A. One from Rishka Rikani asking, Vicky, if you've got any more details about the green corridors and what your port plans to do to ensure that this is a future trend that all UK ports can adopt or follow.
No, and I think that's the golden question, isn't it? We don't know much about this Clydebank Declaration, and it was great. It was announced during COP, but actually we're finding it very hard to find out, well, what does this look like? And I think it's very early days for the the government to let us know more about what it is, where it is. What we know so far is there are 6 across the world. Obviously, we could probably create far more than 6 just in various UK corridors. But absolutely, it is a great ambition, I think, certainly for many corridors. What we do understand is that we have to involve our whole port ecosystem, for want of a better term, all of our port partners, and it does then pass down the supply chain. It also obviously passes through all of the customers, and for us that's a huge challenge. So we will need to work with sort of local government, trade industry bodies, as well as our own direct customers, so the ferry operators. It's a huge task to make a truly green corridor. There is a caveat, I seem to remember, when reading the declaration around not all vessels or all parties within the corridor need to be fully green. That's interesting. So we want to find out a lot more, from government about what this means. And I know that BPA and yourself, Mark, are certainly helping the industry to understand more from the government about exactly what does green corridor, what does it look like?
Yeah, I think you're right, Vic. I don't think government knows exactly what it's going to look like itself yet, so we look forward to that. Colin, have you any thoughts before we come
Yeah,
to
so it's only 3 pages if you want to read it, so it's not going to take much of your time. It's a couple of observations. It's a UK-led initiative. UK championed this at COP. So my assumption is that the UK is going to need to show some leadership on this and fund and support some early corridors. Second observation is it has 2 types of corridor. There's the international corridor, but it also includes corridors within the same state. So you could envisage that there could be, I don't know, based in Scotland and in Ayrshire, Cairn Ryan to Larne comes to mind as being an example that there might be fit that, but there are other routes obviously further north in Scotland and some obviously out to the Channel Islands, etc. So there could be smaller scale initial ones that might not necessarily be huge investment to get going.
Interesting. Would it include inland waterways or sort of coastal shipping, Colin?
I think that's not quite clear. I think I don't think it's that. It's in the 3 pages. It's not that specific.
I don't share your. I'm not sure that the UK government sees itself as telling other countries what their green corridors. That's my impression anyway. But
correct.
I think,
the internal ones could be. You could see that.
Yeah.
Let's just take a little political point here that you could see a green corridor to Northern Ireland being an interesting one, both in political as well as practical terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does sound like that some other countries are already a little bit more advanced in their thinking of what, developing these things. So it's interesting anyway, and we look forward to the developments there. But I do want to pick up a provocative question from Phil. They always are. I love these ones. Vicky, Dover-Calais Green Corridor will not be enough to make an impact. What about one of the true ocean routes, a big deep sea, sort of maybe Asia to Europe? Is that not a real green corridor?
I think any corridor we can green has got to be, a positive. With little acorns, great oak trees grow. So I just think, we've got to do what we can within your own remit. So yeah, for sure. Those ocean-going deep sea vessels has been recognised. Maritime impact, emissions impact. So yeah, sure, they've got to be looked at. But I think all options have got to be looked at, and obviously the one I can look after at the moment and I'm particularly interested in is that short strait, because strategic importance to UK trade. So yeah, I couldn't disagree at all. No, I think they are important.
It doesn't have to be a choice, of course. We don't have to. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
One or t'other, indeed.
In my humble opinion. But thank you for that. Right, let's take some other questions. I've lost my place. Where are we? We've got one from Phil. And we'll come back to Jeremy and Phil's other questions, but one from Phil. Thanks. Does Vicky? Another one for Vicky, but we'll give Colin a go at it as well. Do you believe the findings of your Clean Maritime demonstration project will be implemented without additional funding from the Department for Transport, or will this rely on your customers' vessel fuel operators adopting a common fuel strategy to make it economical, regardless of decarbonisation benefits? So, do you need, will it stop once the funding's run out, or is it something that can continue without further support?
Yeah, it's the big question, isn't it? Certainly, most of the demonstration project options that are looking likely to come out of this particular feasibility study will require significant investment, and it's something that the port is looking at, the best options for funding that. Of course, anything that we can gain, sort of funding from DFT or wider, then yeah, that gives a bit more security to where the projects can go. But yeah, things need big investment. So we're looking at all sorts of funding options. The second part of the question, yes, and certainly if any of our customers, but in particular at the moment, looking particularly to that project, if they could all agree on a similar route, fit similar fuel strategy, of course, that makes our life as a port easier. It would do anywhere, because then you are looking at one set of infrastructure, and you can really concentrate on that. So certainly it's something that we are talking across our 3 ferry operators here, so that we can better understand what they see their future fuel strategies would be. And that was sort of the point I was trying to make back at the beginning. We have multiple types of operator within our port, and they're all looking at slightly different options at the moment, and nobody's really pumping for one. As decisions are made, we can then better understand what we need to provide our customers with, and then can start looking at the options to do that.
Thank you, Vicky. Colin, any thoughts on role for government in funding these things in the future?
I think finance is obviously key. I think the private sector, you can see in the shipping, concentrating shipping here for a moment, because I've probably spoken to more people about finance, but shipping, I'm certainly conscious that the financiers and owners of the shipping are very conscious about the life of their asset, what they build now, and whether that asset will be usable or impaired as an asset at some point in the future as the zero carbon fuels become more dominant. So you can see the private sector finance element here being important for the shipping. I'm less involved with finance for ports, and whether the private sector interests in that might be an aid here, but they are getting scrutinized under the TCFD legislation, or initiative rather. So the funders in other sectors, other parts of the sector, are certainly conscious of these issues and how they adapt to match them. Whether that translates into ports, I'm not close enough to port finance to know.
Thanks, Colin. That is the whole finance thing, and government's role is probably going to be the biggest area of contention over the next few years, I think. Right, we've got a few minutes left and some more questions to get through. This is great. One from Hoop van Rosmalen. What role do you see for digitalisation of ports in reaching decarbonisation goals? Colin, do you want to start us off with that one?
Not my specialist topic for me, but we do have quite a lot of people working on data science, which we tend to apply for monitoring and measuring air quality. We do a lot of data work around air quality, including apps for local citizens to know whether pollution is going to be high on a particular day and if they need to change their journey. I think if you look at the draft EU legislation on emissions trading and shore power, there's quite a lot around monitoring and verification, and therefore will require data collection on vessels and within ports. So you can see that associated with the compliance part of all this legislation, there will be a need for data and digital systems alongside that. I am aware of, but not involved with, things like autonomous shipping, and obviously there's a lot of data in that. I'm not claimed to be a specialist in any of this, but I can see some trends that would require far better data and therefore management of data.
Thanks, Colin. Vicky?
Yeah, I think in addition to the monitoring and data, I think, yes, digitization across the board, from automation through to even some simple things. An example that we came across just only within the last couple of weeks, just controlling our parking permits digitally, reduces paper, reduces the printing. Just one tiny example where it's all part of the decarbonisation sort of piece. So everything from, the great big, and again, I'm no expert in this at all, but yes, autonomous, whether it be vehicles or reach stackers, cargo handling equipment. Digitization can also come into how you manage your energy. So if you've got a smart grid within your port, and how can you spread that energy evenly across your port to the areas of demand at given times? So a short answer to that question, absolutely yes. Thanks,
Vicky. I think Waterfront are going to have to do a whole nother webinar on digitalization of that's a really interesting topic on its own. A specific question from Jeremy to Vicky, Jeremy Littlejohn. Are Dover planning on including including carbon emissions on the tender scoring for next expansion work within the ports? A very specific question.
That is very specific, and I can't really answer that. Can't give people a heads up, but absolutely, it's got to be part of the whole selection criteria. Exactly what that looks like right now, I don't have that knowledge, but you know, certainly has to be part of that whole piece.
Colin, is that common in your experience, or is it becoming more common?
Yes, and it depends on the sector. Some sectors coming earlier. I was, get a real example, HS2, all the supply chain are being required to have carbon targets and actually physically reduce carbon. I've seen the same in the water sector. That's beyond framework contracts, supply infrastructures, the water, you have to have net zero targets and deliver on them. So that's part of that kind of scope 1, scope 2 to scope 3. Examples of that coming into reality in infrastructure as well as vehicles.
Thank you. And I'm just going back, one from Phil Buckley earlier on. What can ports do beyond shore power for shipping to help them reduce? So Phil says ports doing a lot to reduce their own footprint, but what can we do to help ships reduce theirs beyond providing shore power? Colin, do you want to start us off with that one?
Well, obviously the dominant emissions is from the actual fuel burn on the ship. As we've touched on several times, there are a wide range of fuels. Not all ports, I think, will have all the types of vessels, nor all the types of fuel. At the moment, the refueling bunkering arrangements will be quite different at different ports, whether it's a separate business or a part of the port business. So I think in future, it's possible that some ports, either because they're leading operator will require them, or will have an agreement to switch to one fuel, might choose one zero carbon fuel. But I think it's less likely that every port will have multiple fuels available. So that will sort of kind of channel investment and trade for those vessels that use those fuels. And if you see a trend that, let's take the big transoceanic vessels where ammonia has been talked about as being the likely fuel of choice, those ports with that terrain likely therefore to have some kind of ammonia facility, but maybe not some of the other facilities, and therefore we could see more stratification, if that's right, focus between the port, the shipping lines and fuels they provide, and therefore more specialization.
Brilliant, thank you. Vicky, any other thoughts on?
Yeah, not really. I mean, other than what we can do is work with them and stay in communication with our various customers to understand how much influence do we have. I think it depends on exactly as Colin has said, you know, how many operators you have, and probably minimal for many of us, but we have to stay in communication so that we can understand which routes they're going, and do our best to supply those. If there are some elements that we would find really difficult to supply, some fuel types that we would find difficult to supply, then obviously you want to try and influence the steerage in an area that you can supply. So basically it's down to communication and keeping up with the where the conversation's going.
Brilliant, thank you. There are some comments going in the chat there, some really interesting discussion going on there, and feel totally agree that if ships do really become carbon free, there may not be a need for shore power, which is one of the points we've been trying to make to government. That is a big risk for those installing, looking to or thinking about installing shore power on for a 30-year basis. If it's not going to be used later on, these stranded assets are a very real threat if someone does find a way of making cheap hydrogen or something else. So absolutely agree. There's loads of other really interesting comments in the chat, but I promise that I will finish on time. So to do that, I just want to very quickly thank Colin and Vicky. Really interesting presentation and responses to the questions. Obviously only an hour to discuss a huge topic that we're going to be talking about for a long time. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you everyone for your questions and for your engagement in the chat. I found it really interesting, a bit of a whirlwind, covering lots of different topics, but thank you very much. And thank you to Waterfront for hosting, but we'll leave it there. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.